So my name is Edward Barton and this is Johanna Westermann. We are both Master Urban Design students at the TU Berlin. And as part of our platform project on the transformation of the Berlin-Brandenburg region until the year 2040, we would like to welcome Professor Sabine Knierbein to our interview series. Sabine is head of the Interdisciplinary Centre for Urban Culture and Public Space and Associate Professor for Urban Culture and Public Space at the Faculty of Architecture and Planning at the Technical University of Vienna. Her research is focused on the political role of public spaces and their potential for urban emancipation in an age of shrinking democracy. Thank you very much for joining us today, Sabine.
Thanks so much, both of you and the Institute for the invitation. I'm looking forward to our talk.
So our interview will be divided in three main parts. The first one will be the city as a driver for societal transformation. The second, defining public space as an infrastructure for alter politics. And the third one, urban struggles and the rural divide.
In your book, City Unsilenced, you look at different urban resistance movements across the globe. For example, the Gezi Park protests in Istanbul, or the 100% Temple Initiative here in Berlin, and you investigate the linkages between public space and urban struggles in the context of the neoliberalizing city. What are the most important causes for these resistance movements, or what challenges do they try to withstand?
So thanks for the question. I think, of course, all these different resistance movements around the world that have been peaking maybe in more or less the last 10 years have very different causes and very also past-dependent specificities. But nevertheless, I guess if you can find one main thread that maybe stretches throughout all of these different case studies, it's an increasing pressure on everyday life of people in cities and in metropolitan regions. So, but these pressures on everyday life, they may come or may arise from very different sides. They may be because of climate change. They may be because of socioeconomic transitions. I mean, of course, what we also see is, and you've mentioned that already, the political transitions and crises that many different countries, but also cities and city governments are going through. So there's a wider shift that we see, which we currently working on in a new book, which is called Urban Space Unsettled. And we had a huge conference on that because we wanted to understand these types of unsettling that are characterizing the last decades and that are influencing also on the lived spaces and the everyday lives of urban inhabitants.
You decide to research this new book because you believe that there will be more struggles coming in cities?
Let's say the motivation for that book, for the City Unsilenced book, was rather first to understand the recent wave of sort of urban resistance that we saw with, of course, Occupy Wall Street. Then we had the Indignados movements, we had the movements in Spain, the Arab Spring, then shortly later all the movements or different movements in Asian cities. But at the same time, we also wanted to, let's say, contextualize them, because many people and many scholars would see, okay, this is the new wave. But we said, look, if you have a look at different locations in the global south or in the European south, we have an increase in resistance movements already since the 1980s. Yeah, Athens or Argentina, yeah, Buenos Aires, Cordoba, etc. So this is not new, but it's like peaking right now, and we need to understand why it's peaking. And of course, the world financial crisis of 2008 was playing a major role in these peaks. But I think just understanding it onwards is not sufficient in order to really see the causes of these practices. And as regards the new book, then of course, when we had a new conference with a new team, we met on the day when Brexit was decided, actually, and we had a Scots member on our team, and we said, there are so many different transitions and crises. Yeah. We have also heard about multiple crises, etc. There's a lot of books on that. but we see how the life of urban inhabitants in different places of the world gets increasingly more unsettled. But at the same time, also new routines get settled. And settling is part of urbanization. So these multiple meanings of settling and unsettling, we thought that they are really productive in exploring this time we're in. And I guess we don't yet know how to frame that time, but we said that through this focus on unsettling and settling, we can grasp a bit more the analytical, or we can get analytically closer to understanding what's happening.
I mean, you were talking about everyday life. What are examples for this unsettling of the urban population?
You can find that on the one hand, for example, on the social level, because of course, in the context of the increase of neoliberal urban policies, we have pension cuts, we have social welfare systems breaking down, basic services that were free to all or free to most of people in need in the past years have been under attack. But of course, you also feel political unsettling, because I can give you the example of Vienna. We have municipal elections in the next 1 to 2 months. And it's clear that half of the population does not have an Austrian passport in Vienna. And there is an increasing claim of this part of the population to be acknowledged as a voter. Yeah. And so this is also part of unsettling. And at the same time, you could also turn unsettling, or it has been used also to criticize modernist planning and modernist urban design as being too functionalist. Yeah, so unsettling can also be innovative. Yeah, we hear a lot about disruptive urbanism, for example. But at the same time, we need to see which new routines become settled afterwards and how socially inclusive and socially equitable they are. Yeah, so these are just 3 or 4 meanings of unsettling, but there are far more to that. So you can also take it to the ecological level or to the cultural level.
So in light of the global and local challenges, I mean, some of actually which you already mentioned, so climate change, migration movements, and real estate speculation, our platform project is based on the assumption that a number of important systemic changes are necessary to make future living in Berlin-Brandenburg inclusive, equitable, and ecologically sustainable. So what can maybe Berlin or the region, together with Brandenburg, learn from the case studies that you investigated?
Conflict, or let's say an everyday rubbing along in public spaces that sometimes is loud, is not necessarily something bad or something to be feared by the urban administrations or the urban politicians. And I guess cities have very different cultures in this respect. Just if I have a look at in comparison at Berlin and Vienna, yeah, in Berlin it's quite normal that I guess the political elite is reproduced through people who have been active in protests. Whereas in Vienna, the city directly or embraces protest or just criminalizes protest. There's no way in between. So this is just between the 2 cities very different. So I guess in a city like Berlin, which has such a long tradition in including people that have been, let's say, a part of emancipatory movements into their institutional system, this is not so much the issue. But maybe what is important is also to see that urban resistance movements inform urban designers and planners to not just understand the role of public space and institutional politics, but also the role of public space and the formation of the political. And that's something I guess we have seen increasingly in the last years with many different motives for protest. And usually in urban studies, we have very much embraced protest as something automatically emancipatory. Yeah. But what we at the same time see at the moment and in the last years, we have that type of protest that we wouldn't consider as democratic even. Yeah. So how can we deal with forms of protest that undermine the democratic nature of public space? And do we have analytical tools to do that yet? And that's of course very much an issue, not just for improving the well-being of the region, but also improving the fundamental role of public space as the constituent of democracy somehow. And working on the spatial aspects of democracy. But I guess what we can see from our case studies, but also from the further research we've been doing, is that many protests, they have been coming out after spatial interventions. Have a look at Stuttgart 21 movement, yeah? And I guess Stuttgart is one of the clearest cases. Sometimes these interventions have been quite inclusive, but at the same time, urban design interventions have been used after protests to streamline and to newly regulate and to commodify public spaces in order to prevent further protests, like in the Maidan, etc. So it's very, very important to understand, I guess, that we call that a relational material approach, yeah, that the urban form is an expression of these social, cultural, economic, and political processes. And it's quite complex, of course, to see the direct relations.
So in the second block, we would like to hear more about your definition of public space and how it functions as an infrastructure for altered politics. And in this platform project, BB 2040, we understand infrastructures as a landscape of resources, processes, or systems that constitute the foundation of the urban life. And therefore, it also plays a key role in processes of transformation. What is your definition of public space? And how does it maybe relate to this concept of infrastructures that we have?
First of all, we use, and that's always the tricky question because the public space debates are so wide, but what we use is a definition that has been used by colleagues since the 1980s, that public space is where public life eventually unfolds. Yeah. So there is a clear relation between public space debates and debates about public life. So the life that's out there in the city, and this is of course quite heterogeneous. As opposed to wide debates that would first of all talk about the public sphere in a more political theory kind of sense, which would relate the public sphere to the public opinion formation, yeah, how a public opinion is formed. And that has been very much discussed by Jung Habermas, but also critically by Nancy Fraser. So, but we say that first, and there that might be interesting for later focus as well. We very much work with works by Cesar Lowe and Neil Smith, who are public space experts in New York. And Cesar Lowe is also an anthropologist. And in their opening chapter to the politics of public space, they said that public space is the geography that constitutes actually the public sphere. And we cannot understand the political meaning of the public sphere without understanding public space and public life. Yeah. And that has been super helpful, but I have to admit also that the debates around public spaces originally have come into being in urban development as a critique of privatization, commercialization, and turning space into a commodity. And Ali Madanipur, who is one of the key public space scholars based at University of Newcastle upon Tyne in the UK, has actually written a nice piece last year where he says public space between rhetoric and reality, because what happens is that public space has become the key, let's say, concept of neoliberal mainstream policies. Yeah, so neoliberalism has embraced public spaces and has transferred its meanings, and that's of course from the research side quite problematic, because we would need to address these ambivalences all the time. And that's why I've been sort of deconstructing a bit this idea of public space, not completely, but through further developing the concept of lived space based on a critique of everyday life. And that has been important because in urban studies, there's so much talk about the work of Henri Lefebvre, with 3 different books having been published. First of all, the production of space, which is so much cited. Then the urban revolution and the right to the city, of course, with the Paris student revolutions in the 68s, being this a consequence of also writing this book. But what Lefebvre also wrote, and what has been quite unacknowledged in urban studies, is the 3 volumes of Critique of Everyday Life which analyzed the urbanization of France through an analysis of everyday life over a whole century. And this has been very important and under-acknowledged. And so my focus has been actually to reintroduce that and update that through more recent positions like Asef Bayat, who has very much worked on everyday life practices in the Global South. And in order to update what we need to understand and analytically add in order to come to a more updated critique of everyday life. And that brings us back to, let's say, revisiting the concept of public space and also filling it with more democratic meaning.
Well, yeah, maybe we can talk a little bit more about how everyday life has changed. I mean, and why.
So one basic assumption a century ago by Lefebvre was that, I mean, this is also understanding urbanization as a key vehicle of capitalism. Yeah. First, let's say the early capitalism or late early capitalism in the beginning of the last century, passing the Second World War towards late capitalism. And he says capitalism has seized the industry, has seized the countryside, and its ultimate target is to occupy everyday life and to work through all the pores and niches of everyday life. And of course, nowadays perspective, this might seem a bit modernist or dystopian, and we might translate it into nowadays theorization. But what I can take from that is that everyday life is more than a micro level of urbanization. And that has been conceptually one of his key ideas, that you need to always entangle the micro with the macro. And for me, everyday life is the key analytical sphere where you can see how global capitalism works or how local resistances interfere with that. And you can see a lot of different scales in everyday life, not just the micro. So that's a key, and that's of course coming from a feminist tradition. We need to reinterpret everyday life as a key analytical interface to understand urbanization. And that's what I love of scholars like Asef Bayat, who still work on global changes, but at the same time they always do it through local processes. And you've asked for what has changed in urban everyday life. And of course, that's different in different regions and cities. But of course, what we see is, and that relates a lot to public space in the capitalist countries of the North or West, an increasing individualization of social structures, yeah, and fragmentation of social ties, which very much leads to a more individual take on public space and public life.
Can you say something on, I mean, you mentioned this individualization, and that's certainly also relating to a lot of identity processes in society that, as you mentioned, right, some are emancipatory, some are probably detrimental to a certain extent. Do you have any clues on how public space can respond to this individualization in a positive way? Or to put it more simply, if we feel less and less part of a bigger community, is there a way how public space can actually give us this impression in a way?
I think it would also, before I come maybe to the urban form back and to the infrastructures, which we haven't not yet linked, I think it depends very much on the quality of urban life, yeah, and then rather seeing the urban form as something that is static and that is there all the time. It's good to connect this material and product dimension of urban form with, let's say, the process dimension. And again, Ali Madanipur said, I guess, and he's an urban design theorist, said that there's never ever final point to shape the city. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So it's never fulfilled, or as we say in German, vollendet. But maybe coming also to the infrastructure debates, because you mentioned something very interesting, which I hadn't yet read in the preparatory paper, which was actually that you consider infrastructures also as something that is foundational to social life. And there I would definitely agree. And because that's also what I was working on in my recent work, in my habilitation treatise, because I was trying to link these, let's say, relational conceptions of public space to sort of infrastructural debates as well. And it's very interesting because some scholars in the infrastructural debate, they have explicitly tried to connect a dialectics of everyday life with a take on infrastructures. And in this case, that was Colin McFarlane. You might have come across his work. And I think that's very interesting because if we think what can sustain and materially sustain everyday lives and cover up for what has been lost when welfare systems have been cut down, then of course this has been this should be part of the social infrastructure. Yeah, the libraries, for example, we see in Britain at the moment the cut in libraries and a complete decentralization, that they are responsible to make their own gains, etc., and most of them have to close down. So what we understood as public institutions that were part of modernist planning, usually you would build kindergartens and schools and hospitals and all these places in between that might not be so super institutionalized as social infrastructure, but neighborhood meeting points. Maybe it's just a cafe in a district that's not having any ground floor activity, for example, yeah. Or maybe it's about mobility and the frequency, how many buses go there per hour. Yeah, so it's also, you can take it also to the direction of mobility infrastructure. But what is key, I guess, conceptually is that also, while we can be very positive that public life and urban life can be sustained through social infrastructures and a wide web of different caring social infrastructures, Fran Tonkis from the London School of Economics, she talked in her 2013 book about infrastructural inequities. So I guess before we try to improve something, we need to analyze also how previous infrastructural investments have actually produced severe social and urban inequities.
Maybe we sort of can come back to the political function of urban public space. Mm-hmm. Because in your book, City Unsilenced, you categorize these resistance movements in mobilization, reclamation, negotiation, and contestation. And we were like, what would you say are the key aspects of how the physical public space can actually fulfill these functions?
It's quite interesting. I guess there was some studies on Tahrir Square and the modernist design of Tahrir Square, which was quite wide, with wide modernist streets, which would allow the gathering of big masses of people. So that's interesting that infrastructures that from nowadays perspectives we might consider as overcome or obsolete, yeah, especially the big car-oriented design of, let's say, modernist urbanism, might have actually, on the one hand, through the functional separation inherent in the conceptualization, contributed to the fragmentations of the city and to produce the crisis, but at the same time they also help the gatherers to find a place. Yeah, and so in that sense, that was interesting to see. On the one hand, in public space design, there's a tendency to create wide spaces. I don't know whether you know Karlsplatz in Vienna. It's just in a very central location, lots of institutions like TU Wien and Wien Museum, etc., directly based there. And it is a nice design because it has a lot of small niches where people can have a picnic, and you will find a niche to sit down without consuming anything, just relaxing. It's very nice. And now with the new Vienna Museum, there's the idea to erase these niches, which work well on an everyday life basis, and to have one big plaza for representation. And on the one hand, we have criticized that a lot because it has now a huge everyday quality of inviting different people, yeah, because it has these different niches. But at the same time, I mean, a big wide plaza in demonstrations could also be very strong. Yeah, because you see the masses. So I guess in these types of ambivalences, we've worked on the part of mobilization. Yeah, and also interesting around which types of projects are the protesters gathering. Yeah, like Miyashita Park in Tokyo. It was a branded park, and Tokyo was trying to prepare for the Olympic Games, and there was more and more branding of parks. And so the protesters were actually attacking that because through the branding process, actually the homeless population was expelled from the park. Yeah, and so that was a key focus of resistance of the protesters. But then in the later parts, I mean, it's also that we wanted to actually, there is a lot of social movement studies in political science, in sociology, and also in urban studies. But what we were like scanning through the books, and we were saying that, okay, first of all, there's of course different phases of social movements and their emergence, yeah? And the books and the 4 parts that you've mentioned actually reflect these phases more or less. But actually there's not so much spatial inquiry into these different forms of parts of these phases, and we need to understand the spatial dimension here. And when it comes to the political, there's also a chapter that me and my colleague wrote about protests against the far-right academics ball in Vienna. And it's interesting, and we compared it to the moment of the big refugee year 2015, when on a weekly basis, I guess 20,000 refugees came to Vienna from the Balkans and were or stayed in Austria and Vienna, or were further continuing their journeys towards northern countries like Germany and Sweden, etc. So, and we have 2 different movements. One is a completely, not completely, but mainly on movement based on anti-politics, like resistance against something. But this is also spatially manifested. It's taking place on the Heldenplatz, the hero square, which also is very symbolically, in front of the Hofburg, the main former imperial palace. And in the Hofburg, you have the far-right Nazi scene and also far-right party scene of all of Europe meeting with all the fraternities that are in that spectrum. And they gather and they have a huge gathering. But of course, because of the spatiality of the imperial castle, it's impossible to really occupy symbolically that space. You can just protest in front of the space. Yeah, there have been some hacks that people try to get in and make some protests inside, but it's hardly impossible. So in that sense, anti-politics also had a spatial dimension, because it was, like, let's say, a real alter politics to change the use of the place. And here we are at the level of use value, was impossible through that built walls and the built structure of the formerly imperial castle. And at the same time, the other movement was completely different, because there was no one. We have 2 main stations in 2015, and in Vienna, like the Western Station, the main station. And people from the Hungarian borders in Hege Shalom, you might have seen now in The Guardian, there was a huge article that Merkel's refugee policy in the end, after 5 years, paid off, and that when there was this march of hope of 1,000 refugees from Budapest Keleti station actually towards the Austrian borders, that was actually the moment when Merkel and actually, I guess, Faymann at that moment still, were taking the decision to welcome the refugees at the Austrian and German borders. It was very important. So in that moment, the Western Station was the institutionalized reception center, but also the new main station was partly inaugurated already, and people would get there as well. But there was no reception center whatsoever, no Caritas, no Red Cross. So there was just a group of youngsters in their 20s, 5 of them or 8 of them, and they were just bringing apples to welcome the incoming refugees there. And they realized that there's no service offered. And they said that this cannot be. And so they set up their own NGO, which is Train of Hope. And within, I guess, 2 weeks, they had 2,000 workers. And what we also did is compare how the Caritas at Western Station worked and how they worked. And Caritas was nearly top down, but also using a lot of volunteers. But like a typical humanitarian aid agent, also versed in working in other contexts and public spaces with communities that are sort of in need and facing social hardship and traumatic experiences. But at the same time, the people, I mean, the youngsters at Hauptbahnhof, they didn't have any clue really on the different issues. But in 1 week, they had pediatrics working with traumatized children. They had Bengali cooks offering food. They had our student union offering shelter nearby, or the Erste Bank, their building was still in construction, also offering the ground floor zones to host people. People living nearby offered a shower. And they could also take food donations from the society, which Red Cross wasn't, or Caritas in that sense, wasn't allowed to. So while the institutionalized player had a lot of institutionalized routines and could not really take in all these ideas, what Train of Hope did was really what we called alter politics, because they took a space that's there, a station in construction, and they just reused the whole premises, and that was not planned. And they self-organized horizontally within just a quick time and were very efficient. And so, I mean, it's a fantastic example for alter politics. But as we said also in the book, most movements actually combine or have features, aspects of both anti and alter politics. But some maybe, let's say, it depends on the balance.
Yeah, and actually I came, I just had a thought about like the yellow vests in France, who actually also were pretty creative in using a public space that was usually not considered as a place to protest. Like these roundabouts became kind of a center of political attention. So I guess there is this element of, well, creativity, which is also very strong somehow, right, for these political protests, or like this reinterpretation of public space. Because on one way you mentioned that it could be interesting to have Karlsplatz in Vienna as a central space where a lot of people could protest and be seen, but we also see this phenomenon where totally unimportant spaces become suddenly, also through the media, because the media are everywhere where it's interesting or where something is happening, can also become spaces of, well, I wouldn't consider the yellow vest as alter political, but of protest, let's say. Yeah.
Exactly, and I guess that's also what, when we wrote and thought about the title for the book, City Unsilenced, of course, we were interested first and foremost in those places that actually were loud, where protest was loud. But at the same time, and that's what I became fascinated about when reading Asef Bayat's book, Life as Politics, he says that, of course, if you are in a context, in an authoritarian or neo-authoritarian context, you cannot protest loudly because you might risk your health or even your life. Yeah, and we have had the case also from Mexico where protesters have been just killed. Yeah? So, and this is serious, and it's becoming increasingly serious in this political state of our world at the moment, I guess. So he says that a lot of resistance goes unnoticed and silent, and it's not the big masses. So the Western ideas, we have a social movement, we go to a street, a known street or a not so much known street, but then we organize, and somehow if the politics recognizes what we're doing, it will somehow end up in political shifts in the agendas or policies or something. But Bayat says no, actually in the countries that he was interested in, and he had some nice case studies from feminist movements and taxi drivers in Iran, for example. We have actually an everyday resistance that is silenced, yeah, and he calls it the quiet encroachment of the ordinary. And this is effective in social change because it's done in a mass fashion. It's many people doing that. And I think we have not yet come to terms in incorporating that lens in analyzing social movements also in the Western cities and the Northern cities. And it's very valuable to include these perspectives because we might just not have paid attention to something that's already there. And maybe for your debate on social infrastructures, think of obsolete infrastructures that could be opened up to the public, like Tempelhofer Feld has been, of course, quite prominent, but maybe they are less big and less prominent sites. Yeah, activate the access to these sites first and foremost, because once people get to use and appreciate it, they also fight politically for it, maybe if there's something to fight for. If they have no use, it might be more difficult and more abstract.
I guess, I mean, you just mentioned Tempelhof, and I guess it's quite a good example for that. And also it was one of the case studies in the book City Unsilenced. And what I found extremely interesting there is that it raised the question of how the protest and institutionalized participation can work together. And I talked about the referendum that ensured that the Temple of Earth is not going to be built on.
I guess, I mean, in the quoted case study by Henrik Lebun on the Tempelhofer Feld, I guess it worked somehow. But there's a general tendency also of neoliberal urban policies to embrace, of course, civil society initiatives and maybe to also co-opt what they're doing. Yeah, so there is always this risk of co-optation, but that a lot of scholars would then say, no, we shouldn't do that. But I think we need to be a bit more creative here, because there are many movements that are already well versed in legal terms and in political terms. So we see, I guess, in many cities, in Berlin and Barcelona are two cases here that come to my mind, where you see such a diligence and a detail and a very professionalization of the protest in terms of what is regulation, what is a policy, how can I interfere, what lawyer do I need to contract in order to change the national legislation on housing or something. Yeah? So I guess the understanding of how politics works and how one can interfere has since a long time arrived in activist circles, and some are really very good in including that.
Maybe coming back a little bit more to the political function of public space in a more, let's say, classic sense. I wanted to draw the attention to Hannah Arendt's argument that in opposition to the agonistic use of political space, she puts forward that a true political Erscheinungsraum is marked by permanence, meaning, right, in opposition to a protest, we'll have an ongoing political dialogue or discourse happening in the public sphere, and by mutual perceptibility of different opinions, like varying opinions. One could say that most protests are pretty, let's say, mono-opinionized, if one can put it like that. So, to what extent can public space, as it functions today and as it functions since, I would say, a pretty long time, like, I mean, this form of marches, demonstrations is pretty traditional. It has a long tradition. To what extent can it really be a space for negotiation and active democracy if we consider it from this perspective of Hannah Arendt?
I guess maybe first of all, I think I don't agree to the fact that most protests are quite mono opinion. Because just if you have a look at the Gezi Park protests and how many different groups, I mean, conservative Muslims, LGBT activists, they were sitting side by side. So I guess a real and good protest, a mayor protest, reunites very different spectrums in order to try to produce change, or at least claim change. And then I guess, while Hannah Arendt's work on the public sphere is very important, especially from someone who has faced fascism and all the consequences of when this political sphere gets lost, yeah, is very, very important to keep in mind. But correlation not, but something that I've found in the work on public spaces is that while maybe she talks about permanence, for me it's this, again, coming back to everyday life, the quality of a vivid everyday life in public space that guarantees this continuity. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what you see in many, and here it's interesting maybe also to discuss suburban urban space and new dwelling units. We have a lot of, in Berlin might be similar, a lot of re-densification, a lot of new dwelling units being built. And this is, of course, something very different if you talk about urban extension projects in public space where people are not yet there, or if you talk about urban regeneration projects in the lived spaces where people already habit the surroundings, where you know more or less who lives in the surroundings. And I guess, although it's not very visible in the first moment, the urban design schemes that we currently see and how they address public space rather favor a depoliticization of public space. Although some, like Aspern-Seestadt has been one of the major projects in Vienna, they then set up 2 years before people started to move in a quite innovative consortium, Caritas, Labor Market Service, a communication agency, and a landscape office to activate these public spaces and do a lot of activities with the newly incoming people, to create social bonds somehow. And I guess this creation of social bonds is a key idea to also, if you already have social bonds, then it's easier to get also political bonds. There's an issue of one-sidedness, because if you then develop these quarters for just one target group, how they talk nowadays, then it's very, very, or for one part of the overall socioeconomic spectrum, then it's tricky because you know what you produce politically by that. So I guess if you think about new urban design schemes for urban extension or densification projects, social mixture is very important here. Yeah, because otherwise this coming into experiencing social difference will not happen. And what we see is that social difference in public spaces, those who least experience it are the wealthy families in Vienna. They have their own public spaces, yeah. So they tend to self-exclude from the overall public spaces. And so a bit more along with Sharon Zukin's Naked City, while we tend to do research very often on the marginalized groups, and this is still very important and of key importance, I don't want to downplay that at all, rather the opposite. We also need to have a look at the other side and how they use or not use public spaces.
So you focus a lot in your research on public spaces where there is explicit political expression. And so I was wondering how it relates to this idea of third spaces by Oldenburg, right? So these spaces who are neither your private space where you live and nor your second space where you work. I mean, it's a little bit antiquated, of course, this like typology, but still I think it works in a way. How does it relate to these third spaces where sociocultural communities are implicitly expressing and negotiating their political values or their values in general?
Yeah, thanks for bringing me also in connection to the work of Oldenburg, because I was working very much on Soja's conception of third space for my habilitation treatise. And which is interesting because I maybe start from Soja and come back to Oldenburg then. Soja actually builds this idea of third space very much on Lefebvre's idea of dialectics, and that there's something, that there's a niche that always remains. And that is a key aspect of theorizing everyday life, what I've been doing in my habilitation treatise. Because if you study everyday life, the structuralists that also lived in the time of functional separation that Oldenburg was very much interested in, they would always see you can grasp the whole. Yeah, you can have a holistic view on the city. Whereas Lefebvre said it's not possible, it's impossible. Yeah, something will always slip attention, and that I guess has always been later part of many post-structuralists, but also post-colonial thinkers, that you can try to analyze urban everyday life and how it changes, but something is always slipping, and this is the third space actually. Yeah. So what you cannot grasp, what is the intermediary between, and Lefebvre brought it to the level of everyday life, which I think is very interesting, and in that sense, that would maybe stretch beyond Oldenburg's reduction of third space to just the realm where not work and not home is. Yeah, but Lefebvre at some point had that as well. He was like a bit, like in all his books, very contradictory. He started off from private space and had some spatial categorization in the urban revolution. But then in the critique of everyday life, he said, no, it's very important to understand lived space as stretching throughout all these domains. Yeah, that's what I was trying to refer to before when I said we need to think when we analyze public space policy, for example, link it to mobility policy, link it to housing policy or to infrastructure policy. So to see how the everyday experience of people is across these sectoral divides in order to get a picture of how they work together. And I guess maybe this is a bit off topic, but what has been very important and very much cited in urban analysis in the last 2 decades is this top-down, bottom-up idea. Yeah, I call it the sandwich model. Yeah, so and I think I would call it also a top-down, bottom-up dilemma, because when it comes to considering power structures and power circulation, we need to be a bit more, I don't know, matrix thinkers or circular thinkers, because through using top-down, bottom-up, we already reproduce a certain understanding of power structures, which might not always be the case. Yeah. So I think, and usually the third space is very much linked or has been linked to the grassroots. Yeah, production of meaning through maybe protest or maybe everyday uses, social-cultural quality, etc. And I think, again, theorizing everyday life would invite to collapse all these scales into one scale where you can analyze their interferences and do it in a much more circular way than just analyzing, okay, we have now this NGO that is working bottom up. What does it tell us if an NGO is working bottom up? Yeah? Or a state that's working top down? And we find much more nuance in the actual practices. Yeah, and it depends very much on the case, but we should be, I think it disempowers the researchers to some extent to think a bit more creatively about the nuances that might be there. And I guess in the case of the Tempelhofer Feld, we have seen that it's not just top down, bottom up, something like, yeah, it's much more diverse if we have a look at it in detail. So I guess for the infrastructural debate to come back is maybe also to think about if we talk about infrastructures of everyday life, first of all, to have a multi-scalar approach to it, yeah, a multi-actors and multi-spheres approach to it, and at the same time understand everyday life not as something micro, yeah, go beyond this reduction of everyday life. It's Andrew Merrifield, I think I will just get that for you maybe. Yeah. Yeah. Short. I have a quote here. The quote is, I show it. It's from our 10 years brochure, and it's a very nice quote. Nobody can get beyond everyday life, which literally internalizes global capitalism. Just as global capitalism is nothing without many everyday lives of real people in real time and space. Yeah, and we wouldn't get aware of global capitalism or global urbanization patterns if we wouldn't have a look at these changing routines of urban everyday life. Yeah, and they manifest through them, but they are at the same time always contested also through them. Yeah, and that's why everyday life is also the locus of revolt and disruption, unsettling, revolution. Yeah, so and emancipation.
Yeah, and actually, I mean, this might be a little a tough question, but like you were mentioning how this everyday life stretches across different fields and areas and stuff. How, I mean, do you have a set of criteria like towards what we should be aiming in designing this kind of connections, and like what's this experience like that or maybe you have a city or a case study where you say, okay, this is how everyday life should be. I mean, that's a little bit weird, but
first of all, yes, you're right, it's always context specific, but that does not mean that we cannot more generally think about it. And what I've been doing is, after trying to update it in urban studies and more the social sciences and humanities contributions to urbanization, in my habilitation, I transferred this to recent approaches in planning and architectural theory. Yeah, because there are so many, and I said, including my own center, we're part of what we can call a new relational mainstream. Like architecture is getting more social, planning since, I don't know, 2 decades is getting more social. but what does it mean, and on which level are we getting more social? And there are some contributions that take it, I guess, a bit as a fancy tradition, yeah, that are not so much interested in, let's say, the big themes of social inequality and how this relates to urban design questions, etc. So in that work, what I did is actually, and that's not a case study, but more a conceptual approach, check all the different new approaches like performative planning, performative urbanism, ordinary planning, planning for everyday life, and ordinary urbanism, but also the post-political debate, the post-colonial debate, the feminist debate, the newly Marxist debate. So 8 different registers that are currently discussed in planning and urban design, how they address everyday life and how deep they address everyday life. And that maybe that's the key message, not to take it as a romantic sphere. Yeah, we are a bit more Freudian here. Yeah, you have trauma in everyday life as well as you have lust and passion, etc. They're both there. So, and that's why I would rather recommend to work on the ambivalences that are there all the time and see for whom these ambivalences play out in times of social hardship, etc. So some can easily cope with these ambivalences, but others have not the resources or have had previous traumas as refugees or coming from war regions. So in that sense, also memories of past patterns of everyday life might play back into current everyday life, but also ideas about future everyday life might come to our present everyday life. And there's this nice example of the MoMA artist who went around the MoMA districts, and some of them in socioeconomic decline, and asked people, what do you need? And some said, maybe a fridge, or I don't know, I need a tent, or I need something, yeah. And he bought all the stuff and created his art piece out of the stuff. And when the exhibition was over, he would give actually the details to people. This is just to exemplify that it would be important before designing to get to the community, to get to the place, and really do your own analysis what is needed. Another example was in Linz, 09, there was a cultural capital, and they wanted to improve, I don't know, playground facilities in a neighborhood, in a migrant neighborhood, socioeconomically quite, not in decline, but quite low. And they started with participation, yeah, traditional institutional participation. And in German, I always distinguish between Beteiligung and aktive Teilhabe, yeah. And I started from Beteiligung, so more passive participation. And no one would come to the meetings in the evening where the experts wanted to talk to them. And then suddenly they found out that a lot of construction site workers from Serbia, Croatia, Bosnia are living in the districts, and they changed their approach to aktive Teilhabe. So they asked them, okay, we would like to rebuild the public playground next weekend. Can you bring some building material? Can you bring a caterpillar? And they completely reconstructed the whole playground within 1 weekend with the community. So this is more active participation.
The last block that we identified, we want to talk about urban struggles and the rural divide, because the BB 2040 project, its BB is Berlin-Brandenburg. So we look at the metropolitan region and the urban-rural dialectic, and also the dependencies. And looking at the resistance movements that you studied, what role did the metropolitan region, or perhaps even the rural area, play in these movements, both in terms of the participants, but also spatial spillover effects to the rural areas?
That's interesting. And when I have to think of cases from the recent books, I guess most cases in Greece actually were pointing to this importance of what you coined as rural-urban dialectics. So first, I guess here political ecology perspectives are quite helpful in order to consider the city as completely dependent on, for example, the hinterland, yeah, in terms of provision of agricultural groceries, etc. If, of course, there's global processes as well of delivering food, etc. But I guess there's a lot of dependencies that we don't yet see and have not yet analyzed. And especially in that sense, the work of Christian Schmidt and Neil Brenner on these dependencies is quite interesting empirically. The second point, I guess, is yeah, when we talk about urbanization, we've briefly addressed that before. When we talked, for me, urbanization is not bound to the city, to the morphological city as an administrative or a morphological unit. Yeah, and that's also if we have, and I always encourage the students also to think urbanization not just as a local process, but also to connect all urbanization processes around the world as one wider process, because then you also see the dependencies between regions that are far away, maybe, and the place that you're originally interested in. But lots of the and you asked now for the spillover impacts from, let's say, the center towards the periphery. And what's interesting is that in another talk on public space that we had with the Architektenvereinigung in the Steiermark in Austria, it's one of the regional ones. My colleague Aglaé de Croo, who is an urban design professor at the University of Graz, she said actually her experience from working with communities in Brussels, she's from there, and she has an office there, is that you need to activate the periphery first. Yeah, you cannot directly politicize the central public spaces, but they started in Molenbeek actually. Yeah, and Molenbeek has been, after the, I don't know, terrorist attacks in France has been very much coined as the most no-go area. And I've done a workshop with Aglaé in Molenbeek a couple of years ago, and she pointed to how the public schools are equipped or are not equipped with the most decent infrastructure like public sanitaries and toilets, and that this is lacking in the public schools in that district. So I guess it's very important, and they started to activate the people of Molenbeek and other peripheral areas. And suddenly, when now Corona came and the closure came, these different peripheral groups, they joined in also making some action in the center and in the central public spaces of Brussels. So often, and maybe this is not just the case for not the case for Berlin, because Berlin anyway has been politicized so much since a long time. Often in cities where the center, like Vienna, where the center is so institutionalized and so representative, you need to rather start working from the margins in order to get a wider politicization going on.
One more question about this rural dialectic is that we often have strong political differences between the urban and the rural area, which is, I guess, both visible in Vienna as well as in Berlin. But how's this related to the perception of publicness or public space? And to what extent is it possible to create a kind of public space that's accessible for both the urban as well as the rural?
I guess in that respect, again, an example, last year I organized a summer school and I wanted to have different key players from different spheres. And so I invited the Fridays for Future section of Austria to give a talk to the students. There were German students from different disciplines interested in urban development issues. And actually, we asked her, do you always protest in Vienna's central public spaces, or do you go to other streets as well? And then she said, okay, we have expanded our exploration also of peripheral districts, so we always take a different marching route in order to achieve as many people as possible. And then we extended our question also to the rural areas of Austria, because we know that, of course, in the Alpine regions, the smaller villages, they have an idea about climate change, and they want to protect the climate as well because they see it's just in the front backyard or in the front door. Yeah? But at the same time, the voting is quite dispersed. So they said that they tried also to have initiatives to decentralize the movements in order to have a national protest day where people would actually protest in their own places. And that is tricky because decentralization can also then lead to the, let's say, dissection of attention. Yeah. So you have to, I guess, strategically organize this decentralization in form of a movement. But I guess the step to think of activating the villages as a form of protest against climate change was a very well chosen one. And because this also brings up a new generation, and it talks to a new generation of young people, and they are a very important politicizing factor also maybe to change the voters' lines in the rural regions.
All right, thank you very much, Sabine. This was really insightful. Thank you for your time.
You're welcome.